Hello and welcome back to Mind of Success. I'm your host, Moni Millares, a Mexican British living in Asia. I work in fintech and build digital banks from scratch. In my years in the industry, I've realized most of us are in a vulnerable financial position. However, building a business can be a catalyst for change. So I created this podcast. It's about business stories we do not talk about. I chat with entrepreneurs, CEOs, and experts about their journeys, struggles, and lessons to extract gems of wisdom and practical tools so that we can thrive and create the impact we want. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mind of Success. Today, we have a very courageous, amazing, adventurous, pioneer woman. So we've got Vicky Smith. She is the founder of earthchangers.com. And genuinely, she is a force of good. She is a challenger. She is entrepreneurial, and she is helping to drive basically the future of the planet, having impact in something that is very close to many of our hearts, that it's like travel and tourism. So she's dedicated her career and life to drive sustainable tourism since many years ago. She has a very interesting story. So Vicky, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm sure it's going to be a very fun conversation. So let's start with the basics. Can you tell us a little bit of who you are, what you do, and how you got involved with sustainable tourism?
Sure. So yeah, you said Vicky. I'm the founder of earthchangers.com, which is what I would say a curated collection of positive impact tourism. Now, I've worked in travel and tourism for 25 years, more than that now, and in sustainable tourism more than 15. And I started because after university, I studied French and international business. I wanted to spend some time in France speaking French. I was also a skier, so I went and worked in the Alps, got told it would ruin my career. I was expected to go into a sort of blue chip marketing role or even law or something like that. And I discovered I loved it, and I learned more doing that probably than many of my friends who went into sort of blue chip graduate recruitment jobs. So I stayed working in travel, initially in the French Alps, both summer and winter, back in head offices helping recruitment, and then I got into marketing development, and then ultimately in the late 90s came back to London, and I worked in web development and marketing, so quite early days for that within travel, and actually also international events. And it was sort of the first .com bubble. And yeah, so experienced startup world in the late 90s, nice. Which was pretty full on, and fun. And then worked for sort of bigger travel companies, because I working in digital development and marketing, really at that point it was only the big companies that were doing it, and they had the jobs. And so I worked for some big names in this country, teletext people might know. I worked for Virgin, I worked for some of the other big tour operators. But in working for the very big tour operators and working in the mainstream travel industry, although I'd been originally sort of brought into the travel industry through my love of actually the outdoors, nature, wildlife, wilderness, suddenly you become involved in this very behemoth of an industry, which is that mass package holiday industry. And suddenly I was witnessing the negative impacts that actually creates, which I never obviously sort of was aware of when I first worked in travel.
Yeah.
And through, more and more time, I suppose this sort of sat more and more uncomfortably with me. And a particular trip I had was to a friend's wedding in Kenya. I got a cheap deal through work. I stayed at an all-inclusive because it was who we worked with for work, whatever. And I was horrified. I was, first and foremost, this was 2001, 2002. On the way from the airport to the hotel, I'd never seen such mountains of plastic before in my life. And it was my first time to Africa, and I was excited, and I was really looking forward to the wedding. I was going to go on safari. I was going to, I just didn't know quite what to expect. and it was just plastic and rubbish. And I came to realize, they just didn't have the social services to have refuse collections. They didn't have the money to fund that, the facilities to deal with that. And as we got to the hotel warned people not to go outside the all-inclusive walls. And I was like, what?
What do you mean? I'm here on holiday.
Why would you not do that?
Yeah.
Travel is about culture and meeting people and seeing things and what have you. And, this sort of all-inclusive product at that point was very much about, you're there to eat and drink and tan as much as you can, and you stay within the walls and you eat Western food. And, and I went around the pool, that week, and I talked to people about why they were there and how they booked, and they were there for those reasons. And the vast majority were British clientele. It was maybe 10% that weren't, and they didn't have anti-malarials even. They got a last minute deal. They didn't care where they were going. They just wanted sun. They could have been anywhere on this planet, and they certainly weren't kind of getting involved with anything cultural or even nature. And they were frightened because they were told not to go to the beach and not to talk to people there, and they were frightened that they were going to be attacked or something. I mean, they'd sort of been it's just crazy. And I went on safari and I went to the beach and I did all those things, right? And just realized people are putting fear into people to prevent some sort of cross-cultural understanding here. And they were just trying to keep the money in the hotel complex ultimately.
Exactly.
And that horrified me, that the whole reason I love travel and the whole reason I work in travel, and actually it's about freedom. And in this particular all-inclusive, and then I learned, many, many, many all-inclusives, it was all about keeping within. And if you went outside that all-inclusive walls, yes, you saw poverty, you saw plastic, you saw all the spoils of tourism that we create as Western tourists that they can't actually deal with. And you saw the inequality that it actually creates, and the inequality that is worsened by having wealthy tourists. And I suppose at that point in time, it started to enter my head that there was a difference between the travel that I did, that I was attracted to, and the tourism industry as a sector. Mm-hmm. And that what we had created in the sector, in this sort of vast conveyor belt of mass package holidays, was doing the world no good. And it really should be doing the absolute opposite. And that, I suppose, that always stayed with me then, that I didn't want to work in that industry of conveyor belt holidays that created negative impacts and didn't promote the positives. And I wanted to side with what was positive. So it was around that time that responsible tourism actually got named so. And it was through something called the Cape Town Declaration, which happened in 2002 in South Africa. And they were the first country government to sort of institute responsible tourism within their government policy for exactly these reasons. And it was just like, tourism can help right some of the inequalities in the world. What it should never do is actually exacerbate it. And that's what historically the industry's done in a lot of places. It's exploited, it has taken resources, money, drained cultures, overbuilt, overwhelmed people with sheer numbers of tourism. And that's very much sort of related to capitalist society. It's become about price and commodification, and it's not about how tourism supports local people.
Spirit of travel.
Absolutely. And the definition of responsible tourism is actually creating better places for people to live in and visit. And better places to live in comes first, because if it's a great place to live in, people want to visit.
Want to come, of course.
But the priority isn't to keep the tourists happy first, which is what sort of some of these maybe, demand-driven, all-inclusive packages creates. It's like, what do we have to do to keep travelers happy? Give us Western food and give us, and it's like, no, it's not about that. It's about retaining the original culture. It's about meeting local people. It's about supporting them. It's about saying, how can we use tourism to actually create that scenario?
And you
so that sat with me. And then historically, sort of retrospectively, I looked back and thought, when I'd been a resort manager for a tour operator in the French Alps with ski, and that can get quite crazy. I mean, that you can have lovely small resorts, and then you can have very big, lively, crazy groups and things like that. And, you know, I used to do bar crawls with my guests and things like that. And I looked back and I thought, I mean, I always personally preferred the resorts when the tourists weren't there. You know, end of season, they've all gone home. Lovely mountain communities that you actually get to chat with. You never got to do that in the peak of the season. You know, you chat with the suppliers and you just sit around and, you know, have a coffee and a drink or whatever. And I suppose I felt this enormous guilt of I had helped facilitate so much of that negative impact without really thinking about it. And, you know, I'd done that both in ski and also in ski. You know, I'd seen permafrost melting in the mid to late 90s, and I didn't realize at the time what it was. Why would you? But I was so familiar with the resort and with the slopes, and, you know, I skied most days in some of my years out there. And when you're so familiar with the slopes, suddenly there's something that's a bit different. You think, what's that? You know, and I'd seen sort of this black mass spewing out of the slope one day, and I'm thinking, it's only literally years and years later I understood that was permafrost melting. So you start to understand the environmental impact and the social impact on places, and the fact that, you know, tourism can help. It's probably, you know, it's our biggest sort of army of people going out with money that can help support destinations.
Yeah.
And it's been creating the opposite effect of what it really ought to be able to do. And so I, through that guilt, I suppose, through that penny drop moment, which really kind of came to fruition in Kenya, I just thought, I need to work in the positive side of this. And I don't even know, at that point, I didn't know what it was called. And then it came about through time. And so I got to a point with Korea, also back in London, that I worked for a number of other big companies, and the whole corporate approach of not considering you as a person and your needs, but are very much, you know, you're a number. In the travel industry, inevitably, it concertina is financially up and down quite a lot. There's a lot of redundancies. Yeah. I went through a number of processes. It wasn't always made redundant, but I went through, and I think I just got pretty tired of that kind of corporate focus the way it is, and all the focus on profit, none of the consideration for the actual impact you're creating in the world. And so in 2006, I said to a friend, you know, I just want to go back to Africa. And she said, well, why don't you then? And I thought, well, yeah, there's a very good question. Why don't I? So I did. Yeah. So I packed up and went, and I volunteered on a game reserve in lion monitoring. So very much like sort of Big Cat Diary. And then I volunteered in community development in South Africa, and traveled around Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Namibia in particular. And I wanted to sort of really try and understand how tourism was currently fitting in, how it could and how it should, and really get a good idea of can the travel industry actually help places here? Yeah. And I had lots and lots of work, you know, life-changing moments in that trip, and then subsequent trips, and, you know, small things that when I was in Botswana, and small things that just give you immense life perspective, which I think is something travel does, right?
Yes, it does.
In a way that it opens our mind so much. You know, I was in Botswana when I was 32, traveling through Botswana, and it suddenly struck me that I was reading My Lonely Planet or whatever it was, and the average life expectancy in Botswana at that point in time was 32, and it was the age I was, and that was because of HIV. And, you know, I should have been there, HIV positive, in theory, if I'd been there, multiple children by then, marriage, certainly, possibly multiple even, probably had HIV for a number of years, and probably didn't have access to the antiretrovirals and things like that. And it was just struck me so hard at that point in time that I'd only felt like I just started living, and I had so much to learn and give, that people that I was meeting didn't have much more left to their lives, the local people. And that yet here I was as a wealthy tourist spending money, and they can't get access to the services and the help they need. Where's all this money going? You know, It really shouldn't be that way. So I spent, significant time around communities, and significant time in nature, and nature helps us very much connect with our purpose and connect with the perspective of the world, and just be mindful and meditative around what's our place in the world. And there's nothing like a game reserve, right? I when I did my lion monitoring, we were around 8 people, so 2 rangers and 6 volunteers, in an area about the size of Wales or something crazy. It was huge.
Oh, wow.
And that was just us, and there's nothing like that perspective. And we lived in a very small kind of sort of old farmhouse type place on this reserve, and we had like an outside patio, and you'd go back at night, go back to your room, and we were a bit silly and forget our torches at the time, but all our doors were open. You know, if you didn't have your light, you didn't actually know if you're about to walk in on a lion in your room, because we'd leave all the doors open.
Oh, wow.
So there's moments where you're sort of like, yeah. And we'd be woken up by elephants outside, because when they go, I mean, it's like, the Jurassic Park film where everything shakes. I mean, there's an elephant outside your bedroom, suddenly everything's going.
Oh, wow.
So, amazing times. And then, I mean, later I loved that experience of living on a reserve. So I actually later went back and trained as a ranger in Africa as well. So I've spent so much time, not enough in my view, but much compared to many other people. Yeah. Just really being at one with nature, and also having moments that raise your heartbeat a little bit. I mean, I drove a Jeep down a sort of bit of a cul-de-sac once and got a bit stuck by a bush, and I've got a Jeep full of fellow rangers. It was when I was doing my training, and we had a lion pride following us, and we couldn't reverse. There was nowhere to go. And we literally had to sit and watch and wait for this lion pride to walk either side of the Jeep, and we're all completely open. And literally this male lion, I mean, I felt the hairs on my arm go, and we had to not move an inch. And it's like, that could have gone any way. There's moments like that where you just think nature's amazing, but nature is also
it's a teacher. Force. It's a powerful force.
It's an incredible teacher.
And I absolutely love the story, like the detail and like how much you've lived. And also, of course, you started your business, then the business started growing. Yeah. And well, anyone like who's listening now, it's like, if you go to Vicky's website, you'll see the amount of awards that you've got, the amount of recognition that you've got, the top magazines, the top British TV channels. Like you told me the other day, you've even been invited to the Queen's Gardens party. Like you have, it's amazing. Like you've done an amazing job.
Well, I think what I've done is I've followed my heart and my intuition. Yeah. I haven't, historically, recruitment agents would have a real challenge with me, because ultimately I wanted to work in web development marketing, which is what I'd done, and travel that had positive impact. And that just did not exist in the job market. So ultimately over time I had to create my own, basically. Yeah. And I didn't necessarily think that at the time. It was more a case of I'd come back to this country and I'd do some work in web development marketing. I'd make enough money to be able to go away again and spend time in Africa or wherever it was. And I also, I did do other jobs. So for example, I worked for a charity challenge and volunteer tourism organization, which meant that I could guide their trips as well as being back in the office sometime, and had the most amazing experiences doing that. Because although, you're not particularly paid for it, it's more like you get to do it as a holiday yourself and you're responsible for a group. But, I climbed up Kili and hiked across the Sahara and kayaked down the Zambezi and,
amazing.
Hiked to Machu Picchu, typical charity challenge trips. But what you also get with that is an incredible, particularly on charity challenges, most people that do charity challenges are doing it for a fundraising reason. And often they're fundraising because they've had some sort of loss in their life, probably grief. Yes. They might have lost a partner or something like that. And so for me, it was always an incredible privilege to spend time with people who had probably put the last year of their lives into fundraising for this particular trip. They're doing it both as a physical and an emotional challenge for themselves, and to sort of take their lives forward. Up until then, it's been focus everything on this particular trip, because that helps, that fundraising for whatever issue it is helps distract them from whatever major impact they've probably just had in their lives. Yeah. And they get to a point on those trips more often than not that they suddenly melt down. And that's because they've suddenly realized, there's almost a dawning realization of, oh, what now? It's the end of a phase. It's a sort of acceptance that that's now past, and now I need to move on. And as a tour manager on those trips, where you actually become the kind of shoulder that many people lean on, and you have to, it's very I'd say undervalued job. Most people don't think about that in tourism, but you become quite the kind of psychotherapist at times for some people. But it's the most privileged position to be in, to witness people being able to move forwards with their lives at that point in time. And my drive has always been the world. I love the world, and I don't want to see it damaged, and I want to love the people of the world, and I love the nature of the world, and I want to be that.
Can you expand? I get a feel that like your business is very value driven. There's a lot of force behind. There's a lot of force behind you, like a lot of energy. Like, can you expand it? Like,
I think, like I was saying, I've always driving the business? I've just followed my heart. So what I love is the world, its people, its places, its nature. I don't want to see that damaged. I want to see that people can continue doing that. I don't want to see it, ultimately, I think the industry itself, travel industry itself, is almost the most suicidal industry, because it is absolutely ruining the world on which it depends for its income. And my personal values are around the freedom to explore, whether that is physically, geographically, or also mentally, sort of lifelong learning about other cultures. I'm always fascinated about other people, and connection with those people. So I'll say connection with people, places, nature, spirituality, yourself, because travel gives you that opportunity to really connect with yourself and to think about these things.
It does.
So and integrity, and for me, it's about doing it right. And I think that's what I've always done in my life, is I've always been willing to choose what I feel is the right thing, both for me and for the world, and not just what recruitment agents want you to do because it suits their pockets, and not necessarily what your school or your university want you to do because they think that's the career path you should take. I'd love to say my parents, but they did. They probably didn't care. But, well, they weren't necessarily the best of role models. So, but they also gave me that freedom to go. I need to find my own place in the world, and I've always been, because of actually an upbringing and a quite challenging upbringing, I've always been very independently minded and quite objective about things. I'm very emotional, but I'm also very objective at different points in time.
It's like, I can relate to that.
And it's sort of, you've got the ability to sort of take yourself out of the emotion at times to think, but I also ultimately just follow my instinct and my heart.
Yes. And
I think I've done, and for that reason, I've done things for the right reason rather than a financial reason, or, the times where I did take a job because it was working for an amazing brand. It was awful. And it turned out the brand values were just, created by the marketing department, and they didn't live those at all. And that's where you learn what brand values really mean. And I think
it's so important.
If we come back to sort of personal power, I don't think I didn't used to have it, or maybe at times people recognized it in me and I didn't recognize it in myself because I didn't feel that myself. And I've certainly had a career in corporate life where people try to squash that down, and people try to control that and manage that. And I'm not a yes person, funnily enough. So I'm maybe, people found me a bit challenging at times, but ultimately I wasn't supported to go, you know what, you've got this incredible potential. I never had, or not, that's not fair. I had very few good managers that supported that and lifted that up. And I think I found my own power by setting up my own business, because it can be whatever I want it to be. And that's a challenge financially, and it's a challenge time-wise and resource-wise and all those things. But ultimately, I'm happier doing what I feel is the right thing than doing what I feel is the wrong thing for someone else. And yes, being financially more secure by doing that. But I've never been driven by money. I'm very much driven by righting the world and injustice and things like that. So I think the power then also comes in that authenticity. And I hope that's what people connect with through the website is this isn't, I'm doing nice sustainable tourism that's kind of minimizing negatives and, is sort of, greenwashing to an extent, which is when I launched, I felt that most of the platforms out there, in order to be more financially viable, were a bit fluffy, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I thought, you don't need to be fluffy. There's this amazing opportunity that we have in travel to actually really help people and places of the world and have an amazing experience at the same time. And that could be just having a lovely, relaxing holiday and the money goes into various initiatives, or that could be a bit more hands-on. And so the opportunity is there and no one's doing it. And I realized, I suppose my big moment was I realized that I was in a position to do that in the way that no one else was, possibly even in the world.
Amazing.
Because I had that training back in resorts. I had, in terms of customer facing with tourism, I'd done web development and marketing for years and years and years and years by then. I knew I was a trained ranger in conservation, and all the experiences historically, which I had always done because I felt it was the right thing to do, but without really knowing why at times. The things that recruitment agents drove them potty, because I would have a nice sort of stable job and they would say, right, next you take your step up, and I'd go off at a complete tangent and go back to some developing country and do something, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly all the experiences suddenly made sense for where I was going. But it wasn't until I started my own business that it actually all came together properly. And now I launched in 2017, which happened to be the year of Sustainable Tourism for Development by the UN. I didn't know that at the time when I started, and I didn't know when I was going to launch, and it was just quite serendipitous. So they then authorized me as a solution for sustainable development.
When you say they, you mean
the UN?
The UN.
Well, the UN also has a part called the UN World Tourism Organization.
Yeah.
So, and they're a big organization, a big global thing, but ultimately they try and steer the tourism industry to a more responsible and sustainable sector.
Amazing. Yeah.
So that involvement there, and then through that, I mean, the thing is with awards and things like that is once you get noticed, more people notice you. And so I'm also very active on social media because I'm about connection. So of
course, and social media, it's
I
didn't used to, but now that I'm active in social media,
it's
genuinely about connections. It's
absolutely.
about you have so many, you find people that you connect in very specific.
Exactly. And journalists and other people these days, they don't just go to Google and search, they go to social media and search things. So I was asked to be an ambassador for the UN, for the UK government for DEFRA, Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And they had something called the Year of Green Action in 2019. So they asked me to be an ambassador, and they found me through social media.
Wow.
And they obviously there must be some sort of due diligence that they do on these things, that they then look up your background and go, okay, well, she's trained ranger and she's done a master's in responsible tourism management, she's done this, that and the other. So you become acceptable, I suppose, at that point. I didn't have too much of a dodgy past, basically. But it was funny because I got that email and I literally looked around. I was, where I'm working here. And I looked around thinking, is someone filming me? Are they having a joke? Is this just a wind up? And I didn't believe it. And I wrote back to them and said, well, that sounds interesting. How many people are you having? They just said, would you be one of our ambassadors? How many people are you having? And I'm thinking, well, they're probably asking several thousand. And this is the female typical, what do we call it? Imposter syndrome.
Oh, yes.
I think, well, they're asking me. Yes. They must be asking millions of people, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And they wrote back and they said, oh, well, I think we're having 8 or 10 in total. I'm like, blimey.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's a cool thing. And it was a real shame, to be honest, with that. It got somewhat derailed by Brexit because a third of all the staff of that Department of Rural Environment and Rural Affairs, they got moved to Brexit issues because of farming and agriculture and things. And then, the world went into COVID and then it got shelved further. So, but, it's always, I did some interesting things with them.
So now, thank you. So now that we're talking about the world changing and COVID and all that stuff, it's a sensitive topic, but I think it's important that we discuss it. So now that we have all the violence going on in Ukraine, and the world, basically. And we are seeing so many people kind of like leaving their countries. I guess like the question could be, what's your thoughts about how tourism can help in this situation? That it's a very heavy feeling for everyone.
It is. But to be honest, I mean, what I work in is also quite heavy. But most people just see the tourism side of things, and I'm interested in the sustainable development side of things and how we actually. So I spent a lot of my time, particularly when I was in charity challenges. I spent time in cancer hospices and all sorts of, developing countries, in poverty, in very much witnessing water issues, food issues. I'm a trustee for a charity in Madagascar. We've had on-running famine for years there. And that's ultimately, I suppose, my raison d'etre is I exist for that reason. And tourism happens to be the vehicle through which I believe we can deliver positive benefits for the world. And, that is different whether it's climate or whether it's whatever, but we can make significant impacts with, the big ones recently, climate, COVID, now Azar in Russia. War is obviously a little bit different. Ongoing situations like COVID, we've seen really, the world has the global goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we're all signed up to 2030. And I, as far as I know, haven't been corrected yet, I was the first person to write about the intersection of the SDGs and tourism, and how commercial tourism can actually support them. And so, if you go to my website, the purpose section is all about the SDGs and how tourism can actually play into supporting all of those issues, which it really can, because particularly with sort of remote communities that haven't maybe got alternative energy sources or water or health issues or education, tourism is actually the thing that brings the money and requires the infrastructure. So if that can be created with local people in mind, and because you can create that with them having access to those issues, that's where tourism is a better sector than any other for actual sustainable development. Because let's say something like extractive mining, it only influences a very small area where that mine is and where those people are employed. Tourism is a sector which touches pretty much every corner of the world, right? Everywhere you go, apart from war zones. And that's the interesting thing, I think, now with Ukraine is, we might not be able to have tourism in Ukraine, clearly, but actually there's a lot of people coming out who need support, obviously through other means. And all of the countries around Ukraine, I'm actually involved with supporting and developing as kind of the secretary of the European Ecotourism Network. And we have members in Belarus, in Poland, in Germany, in Romania, for example. And they're all working like crazy at the moment. We're recording this in the middle of the conflict. They're all working like crazy because they're involved in ecotourism. Yes, it's tourism, but they're also involved in sustainable development, and they're all involved in the not-for-profit world. And they're all hands to the deck with donations, with getting things to borders, away from borders, trying to get people into accommodations, for example. And tourism infrastructure at that point can be absolutely reused, whether it's the transport logistics or accommodation to support refugees, for example. So tourism is really important. People think about it as being as a frivolous thing, but in actual fact, the infrastructure of tourism actually can support the world hugely when it needs to, and should do the rest of the time, obviously. So, something I'd really like to do in the future with the products that I have on my site, we have both tour operators and accommodations who are created from core for the purpose of supporting sustainable development. So that might be for refugees, for example. What I found really fascinating is how the world has responded to Ukraine with, for example, renting Airbnbs, but saying we're not coming. So the money they know is getting to local people. That's a tourism infrastructure thing they're using to be able to try and support. Now, personally, I have questions over the integrity of that, because what you're not getting at that point is you're not getting a needs-based approach. The money, you don't know where it's going, you don't know who it's going to, you don't know how much they've got versus their neighbours. Hopefully it's all getting shared, but maybe it's not the time to ask those questions, but I do, because I'm educated at a master's level to critically ask questions about tourism, and we should ask testament questions about tourism, because if we don't, lots of people have good intentions, and lots of people think good intentions result in good impacts, and that's not necessarily true. And that's where we're taught in, for example, master's level responsible tourism, to constructively critique and question and take a critical approach to tourism. Because let's take an example: orphanage volunteering, very well known. Ultimately, the knowledge that Western tourists want to help orphans created a situation that people in destinations created orphanages for the purpose of exploiting money from Western tourists.
Yes.
And in order to then get kids in those so-called orphanages, they would go to families who were maybe impoverished and weren't able to look after their children well, or promise them that the kids are going to be better fed, watered, educated, etc. And so the kids get put in these intentionally dilapidated buildings in order to procure finances from Western tourists. They've been abandoned by their family, and then they experience a hamster wheel of visitors coming or volunteers coming to supposedly help them. But they're kept intentionally in that situation in order to get money. And the kids never see that money, and they probably never end up going back to the family. The families have handed them over with good intentions too. And in actual fact, it's been proven in Nepal, in particular in Ghana, that the rise in orphanages in those countries actually follows the rise in tourism and not the rise in orphans, which is just horrific. So tourism in that instance has created child trafficking. Ultimately, it's created demand for child trafficking. And I mean, I wrote my master's all around a lot of that. I wrote my master's around greenwashing and marketing of volunteer tourism, and that covered things like orphanage tourism, but also walking with lions. So walking with lions or petting lions. Ultimately, those lions are therefore grown up to be habituated humans, and then put in canned hunting facilities, and they're more easily shot because they're used to humans being around, basically. And those humans feel great because they've been able to hunt these lions. And so much of tourism like that, which people think they're doing, volunteers or visitors to an orphanage, and they're doing it from the best of intentions, and that they're supporting those kids. No, that's not happening. And so much is just a horrific sort of exploitative nature of our world and of tourism. And that's all the stuff I want to change. The world, I want to change the industry, I want to change it all.
And doing it. So
well, I'm trying, and I think coming back to the passion question you asked me earlier, you have to have the most immense amount of passion and commitment and willingness to sacrifice. I haven't had an ordinary life, whatever ordinary is. I've had an amazing life, I've had extraordinary experiences, but that doesn't come with a stable salary or necessarily a stable home or even a stable relationship or a stable family. So you have to be willing to not do those things. For me, I was always driven by, I wouldn't say ambition of career. I was driven by making the world a better place, I think, and to achieve what I'm trying to achieve, which I'm still at. I've had 2 years of COVID with very little income, no government support in terms of sector tourism support. I just believe in what I'm doing, and that it's needed more and more as a result of health issue in the world, in the result of conflict in the world, and hopefully in time that will come good.
Yeah. Did you have any regrets of not having, let's say,
really.
Financial support?
No, and I think I've always felt that if you follow your heart, you won't ever regret it, because you've always chosen the right thing for you. And I've always been comfortable with my choices. I think when you regret is when you don't do something you wanted to do, and you do something because someone else wanted you to do something.
Yeah.
So I've always very much stuck to following my purpose, my intuition. not that I necessarily sort of knew that at the time. I kind of just felt, I followed an instinct, I suppose. And I think a lot of people thought I was nuts, and I just did it anyway. And to hell with, we've got one life and it's short. I had a number of, friends, one of whom was terminally ill when I died when I was younger. I had another friend that was on life support at the same time. 2 out of 5 close friends were very ill. That brings immense perspective to life about living your life for what you want to do and what you want to achieve and how you want to enjoy it, and not living it for other people. And there is a little bit of that. Is it selfish? It's more, I'm not a selfish person. I'm about giving to the world.
Yeah.
And I have to give a lot of myself to do that. But I definitely have a compulsion to follow a certain path, almost come what may, and I recognize that in myself. And that's, people sometimes feel threatened by that ambition. But I feel, I'm not a competitive person. They think I am, and I'm not. I'm here to achieve something that I want. They're not trying to achieve the same thing as me.
And you were born to do this thing.
Yeah, I very much feel. I mean, I felt that. I think I felt that was when I went to, I went to Kenya. We talked about that, and that's when my brain started ticking over, and it started percolating about where's tourism's place in the world. And then when I went back to South Africa in 2006 and spent time on a reserve and spent time in volunteering in community development, that's when I realized, that's when I thought, this is my vocation. This is what I'm meant to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it took me, it's not like I knew it to begin with. I mean, I was, in my early 30s at that point. So I found my purpose then. And now it just gets stronger and stronger, actually. And that's partly because the world is getting a worse and worse place to be in many ways. But it should be getting better, and I'm just driven by that. And it's challenging because I don't have enough time and enough resources, and I don't have much at home or what have you, but doesn't really matter to me, to be honest.
That's amazing. That's a very, like at the beginning of the episode, I said that you were very courageous and challenging and entrepreneurial. It is like a different type of woman that you don't find a Vicky Smith every day.
No, probably not. But I don't know what to say to that. But it has, it has come out of adversity, because if I'd had a comfortable background and upbringing, I might have stayed in comfort, and I didn't. So I chose to go off and discover the world, and those sort of creature comforts never mattered too much to me, because actually what matters is how we treat each other, and relationships, and love, and respect, and dignity, and and those things can actually be brought to people through tourism. Getting people having jobs, people in developing countries having jobs, earning a living, that they could, supporting a family, that can bring them dignity that they've never had, and tourism can do that.
Yes.
And because I've seen that, it just reinforces how I feel about that. And I know a lot of people will think travel and tourism is just this frivolous activity, but I mean, it's 10% of world GDP, it's 10% of world jobs.
That's a lot.
It's enormous. If that could be used as a power for good, and that's why it was such a challenge in COVID. We, as a global travel industry, it was hit 80-90%. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of people not in jobs at that point in time, and not able to feed their families, and it was really very desperate in lots of communities. And it also meant that people weren't employed in anti-poaching, for example, conservation, and we have to obviously weigh up the issues of climate and aviation in particular. And aviation fuel is about 2.5% of global emissions to 3.5%. Burnt at altitude, it represents about 5%. But if that 5% supports developing countries, in particular the 50 least developed countries in the world, because take away tourism, and they're not going to have the livelihoods, they're not going to have the dignity, which is important, they're not going to have infrastructure that otherwise might not exist. It also means that money doesn't go into conservation, and we might lose our endangered species. So it's much more a complicated question. It's not a black and white easy answer of we just shouldn't fly, because flying actually contributes and supports so much in the world. that we have to be very careful about not doing tourism frivolously, actually. And yes, that doesn't mean to say you can't have an amazing holiday. Of course you can. You have the incredible experiences in amazing places with amazing people. But let's not fly to the south of Spain every other weekend for a long weekend. We don't need to do that.
Yes.
We don't need to fly for business meetings.
What should we as listeners, what should we be doing?
Is very careful.
Tourism practices.
Like anything in sustainability these days, we have to make our decisions more carefully around whether it's organic and ingredients, plastic use, our beauty products, our kitchen products, all these things. And we have to look at tourism the same. Up until now, I feel that particularly around sustainability, people have not wanted to think about it in relation to travel, because travel and tourism is when they're going on holiday, they don't want to think about those serious things, they don't want to take responsibility, they want time out. And we need to start looking at it as it's another consumer choice, and we have to be careful about that choice to make sure that we don't make negative impacts and make a positive impact preferably. So it's about being educated. Lots of information on my website all about.
Okay, I was going to say, what does it mean to make careful decisions and being educated? It's like,
I mean, we're you're thinking about carbon. I belong to something called the Glasgow Declaration, which is you're signing up for basically carbon plans and reduction of that. But it's not just that. I mean, that's how I determine who I work with in terms of the partners on the website. Tourism's a complex mix. It's not one product. It's a complex mix of services. It's design, it's construction, it's build, it's energy, it's water, it's waste, it's staff and their benefits, it's food procurement, it's all the supplies of linens and interiors, it's
whole industry,
excursions, fuels, guides, it's so many things, and all of those different things have sustainable supply chains. So how I determine when I want to work with someone on my site is looking at all of those things and taking it, there's not a black and white thing here, because sometimes some initiatives are more conservation oriented, sometimes they're more social impact oriented, and it's about taking everything holistically and going, is this a net positive impact? Basically. Awesome. So that's how I work. And we've got to start looking at tourism, not just about minimizing negatives, not about even just sustainability. Like it's fine as it is, as long as we can carry on with the status quo. We need to be choosing positive impact tourism, basically.
Yeah. Definitely.
Which is what I do.
Amazing. And you look so happy doing that.
Oh, I love doing it. I mean, yes, you wouldn't, right?
Definitely.
It's not easy, but it's and I think that's another thing I was going to say. It isn't easy. We were talking about conflict zones, and the precursor to sustainability is peace. We can't have sustainability without peace. We can't have travel and tourism without peace. And you don't get environmental sustainability. Environments get damaged through war. Obviously, people get damaged through war. So the conflict currently just sits so very uncomfortably with all of us, and we all know that it's no good for anybody.
Yeah.
But more often than not, it's not the people. That's the important thing to recognize. It's not the people of that country that want that situation more than that, and it will become more and more important that we have that peace in between cultures and in between people, basically. And so much of what I do is actually about, we have to address the truth, because if we don't talk about the truth and where we actually are, in order to get where we want to be, we don't know how to do that. Yeah. So whether it's carbon or whether it's politics, and tourism is very political because it's geopolitical. We have local governments, national governments, all these, there's lots of politics involved in tourism. All of these things, we have to be able to say, with energy, water, waste, where are we and where do we want to get to? And to say where we are, we've got to be very honest and truthful. And that's not what's happened historically in tourism. It's been pretty pictures in nice brochures. And I don't do that. And that maybe isn't the great sales point. But the point is the advantages and the benefits are for a better world, and not about a pretty palm tree.
Definitely. So as we kind of start closing the episode, given the context of our conversation, that covered a lot. What could be your final remarks for anyone listening?
Gosh, I don't know.
Like, that's my favorite question. Because
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, makes you think.
I suppose, I mean, I'm personally probably driven by justice in the world, really, and the world being a better place, and the world would be a better place when we have equality and justice. And I'm acutely aware of the inequalities and of the injustices. And if we can right those wrongs through having an amazing time and a great experience. Hello?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. Yeah, it's like, let's do it.
Why aren't more people doing this? Come talk to me.
Yes, I love that. Why aren't more people doing this? Awesome. Vicky, it's been an amazing conversation. You have such a wonderful story. Like, I think myself and everyone listening, like, we could keep talking and talking and talking.
Oh, for sure.
Happy
to do that anytime.
We know that. It's been,
yeah, but you know, mindsets are the most incredible, interesting thing, right?
Yeah. It's like, yeah, because like we can just like keep talking about it.
And you know, I'm lucky that I found my vocation. Not everyone does or has yet.
Yes. Okay, so let me ask you just one more.
Okay.
So I think you have found your vocation. I've found my vocation as well. What could you say to people who haven't and they are looking for it?
Follow your heart.
Yeah.
Learn to switch off the outside world and tap into your intuition and literally ask yourself, what would I love right now? And do it.
What could I
and just
right
do
now?
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing.
And that little whisper will take you there, and that will take you there, and that will take you there, and
yeah. And I think
you'll come across it. I mean, I said I didn't, you know, I was in my early 30s before. I worked in travel and tourism for 10 years before I realized it was actually my vocation. Up until that, it was like a job, right? Or a bit more than a job. It was my passion. I loved it.
Exactly.
But it wasn't the vocational aspect that it is now.
Yeah.
So it was being willing to sort of listen to that whisper of what's the next thing I want to do.
Yeah. And I think
letting life take you there almost.
Ooh, I like that.
And
I like the word that you use, like the whisper, because it's like a whisper, e.g. the voice in the head that tells
it's a voice in the head.
It comes back and it comes
and
back
you can so easily shut it down and shut it off.
Yes, it's like, oh, I'm crazy.
And you have to be quiet sometimes to be able to hear it. And I think that's really, I mean, for me, that's really important, is taking myself out of other situations, having some time in nature, probably, to just try to listen to the whispers.
Yes, I love that. Listen to the whispers. So everyone, listen to the whispers.
Thank you.
It's been an amazing conversation. It's been a pleasure having you in the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Okie dokie, everyone. See you next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.